Amazing ants. This is a complex world under your feet. And you can see on this first slide, I am Zachary Prusak. I'm the Florida Fire Manager for the Nature Conservancy. I have been doing fire for about 33 years, but what really got me into biology as a kid and got me my degree from the University of Central Florida, go Knights, was ants. I was told by my parents that when I was a very little kid, that's what I would do. I would actually go outside and eat ants. And so from that very beginning, I just was fascinated by them. And so I would read all the books I could on ants and learned a lot about ants and bugs. And as a total side note, I think it's one of the ways that we get people, especially children, into conservation, into learning the importance of nature, is to let them look at bugs, let them catch things. You know, someone I just saw in the chat talking about their horse mint is blooming, which of course can get covered in all kinds of bees and wasps. So let kids look and catch and study and ask questions. It is, I believe, a great gateway into conservation. So as I go through this tonight, this will just be, so there's so much I could talk about ants. We could be here for hours and days, and I don't want to do that. And so if you have questions, definitely put them in the chat box as I go through the presentation. Excuse me. And then at the end, we'll talk about your questions. We'll answer the questions. And so that'll work perfectly fine, I think. So let's go through some general info about ants. There are 16,462 known species right now. And I looked back when I did this talk back in 2012, and this slide had 12,000 on it. So since then, in 8 years, they've discovered 4,000 species of ants, and probably there's about 10,000 more that we could find. It's just an incredibly diverse group of insects. And the earliest known ants were found in Cretaceous amber, anywhere from 80 to 120 million years ago. The picture on the bottom right is a cool ant called Spicomerma, which has a lot of traits of wasps and ants combined. This is something new on the left. These ants are called hell ants, and they're pretty recent. You could Google that. You can see the head on the picture on the very bottom. It looks as if it's got these pitchforks underneath its chin, and it looks as if it trapped prey by actually impaling it on its head. So not only are we finding new ants that are alive today and contribute to the diversity of life, we're finding new ants as we work backwards in time. Fossilized insects do exist. Amber is a great source because the ants are on trees back then. They get stuck in the sap and we see the amber. So if you think about the diversity of insects, the abundant insects, it's beetles. There's so many beetles, flies, and then bees, wasps within the order Hymenoptera. And ants comprise one family called Formicidae, and they're one of several different insects that have evolved to become what's called eusocial, which this means that they form transgenerational families that include divisions of reproductive labor, like termites have also done this. And so these insects that are called eusocial have become incredibly successful, and especially from the ant standpoint, they occupy anywhere from below your feet to on trees, in twigs, high up on trees. They're very, very abundant. They're found everywhere. And in general, what the evolutionary biologists and entomologists think is that ants that as we know them today, evolved from a solitary wasp a long time ago. So that picture on the lower right pretty much would be the ant's great, 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 great ancestor. They're very unique too because they're really one of the only eusocial predators that exist in the soil and ground litter. Termites are, vegetarian, and they have on their body something called a metapleural gland, which allows them to basically live in habitats that are filled with funguses and all kinds of microbes that might attack them. And so this gland gives them basically an antibiotic ability. So let's talk about the colony structure. It's time for some water. There we go. So if you see ants running around, you see ants in your kitchen, you see ants outside on the tree, what you're looking at is the workers primarily. The queen ant is rarely seen of a colony because that queen would be somewhere below the ground laying eggs to basically then give rise to the worker ants, the male ants. And what's really interesting about the colony structure of these insects is that the male ants are actually produced from unfertilized eggs. And so they actually are haploid. They only have one set of chromosomes. The queen uses the fertilized eggs to basically produce workers. And those workers, then this is really cool because it's all about the timing and the amount of food that the larvae are actually fed during their developmental phase will produce all different kinds of workers. Some with big heads, could also produce other queen ants during different times of the sort of colony, you know, the sort of life cycle of an actual colony. But in general, what you see on the surface of the ground at any time are the worker ants. And ants also follow a really cool pattern of when you first hatch, as you know, you go from egg to larva to pupa. When you're first hatched in a colony, your job as a new ant is pretty much to take care of the other larvae and eggs. And as you age, you basically you get to do more dangerous work. You may go and dig in the colony, and then you may go outside and forage for food. And then your final chore might be to act in the defense of the nest. And so, again, keep in mind that all the ants you typically see are all female. And so how ants sort of do this is that the older the ant becomes, the closer to that worker's death, the more risky the jobs they do, which is kind of a cool way to do it. So where we typically send our young, you know, our humans send their young folks off to fight, ants will send their basically old grandmothers off to fight. So that's kind of the last thing that they'll do. So this is in a nutshell what the typical ant colony is. There's all kinds of varieties of this. There's some ants that are parasitic that only have queens, no workers. Some ants, actually their queens can, or their workers can lay eggs too that develop. And so there's all kinds of variety, but typically this is sort of what you see when you have basically an ant colony structure. And this is really cool. This is a fellow named Walter Schenkel who worked out of Florida State University. And he developed and really pioneered a technique to produce a three-dimensional cast of an ant colony. You can't really dig in the ground and see what an ant colony looks like. So he uses, I believe, molten aluminum and some sort of dental metal to fill, to actually have it go down into the ant colony. And then once that substance hardens, you can dig that up and basically see what an ant colony looks like from you know, basically a three-dimensional form. So this is a harvester ant colony, one that we typically see in Florida. That is, you know, you'll see it in the sand hills and such. And it's very cool. He, I think, sells some of these as artwork here in Orlando. I think if they still have them, the Orlando Science Center has some of these in their display next to the cypress tree. So more about general information about the ants. They're pretty much almost on every single continent. Ironically, they're not on Antarctica, but you know, too cold. But they're very diverse, and they're more diverse, like most things, the closer you get to the equator. Incredibly species-rich places. If you take that equatorial band and go to different places in the world, New Guinea and Brazil and some places in Africa, just tremendous amounts of ant diversity. And a pretty large percentage of the total biomass. E.O. Wilson has a quote about how much of the total insect biomass ants represent. It's a very high number. Between ants and termites, you know, the number of them, not just species, but just simply the number of their, of how many ants there are, it's pretty incredible. If you had the ability to have like ant vision or termite vision and look in the ground, you'd probably be amazed at how much is going on below your feet. They live in what's called the world of smell. A lot of what dictates what they do sort of on a day-to-day basis is based on pheromones, chemicals that the queen will produce, the ants will produce, that can dictate their tasks of digging, of response to an invader, to go look for food. So when you see ants walk sort of side to side, side to side, what they're doing is with their antenna, they're looking to basically stay inside this sort of smell tunnel that another ant has laid down using their glands. And so they're in this really interesting expanding smell tunnel, and that's kind of why they're going back and forth on that. Most ants are not well studied, and this is typical of insects in general. Whenever I used to give insect talks to different schools, people would say, oh, these are all bad. And of course, everyone here in the Native Plant Society knows the incredibly important role of insects. Without insects, we would not be here as pollinators and such. And so where most of the money gets sort of sent to is the studies on pests. And so there's been a ton of money spent on control of, say, fire ants and other pest insects. So the cool thing about ants, like most other insects, is that entomologists, amateur entomologists, you don't need a high degree to discover something very cool about ants or any insect. You can make all kinds of great discoveries by going outside and just watching and looking at the different ants out there and insects. And so we need a lot of people to actually help us as entomologists learn more about ants. There's other great benefits of having ants within the environment. People always say earthworms, oh, they're the best ones at, moving soil around. And yes, no doubt, they do a great job. But if you look outside in your yard or in the woods, you see so many ant colonies. And then think about, all of just the tremendous amount of soil and food items brought down into the nest and soil turned. And there's a constant aeration of soil, nutrients brought down into the ground. They have this nutrient oasis all around their nest because ants are basically dumping their trash outside, their dead bodies, also enriches the soil. We'll show a picture of our own leafcutter ants in Florida later on. We do have leafcutter ants. And, they do a huge amount of work in bringing nutrients into the soil in pretty much poor soils. There are microbes in ant nests, and that increases the decomposition rates in the soil. They also play a role in dispersing seeds, and this has been studied in Australia and Africa and North America, where there's these little tiny, basically little baits that are attached to some seeds that will attract ants, and the ants will take off that bait, throw the seed away, or store it underground, and that might help the seed become sort of planted in the ground in a way, but also protected from other seed predators like rodents. There's some evidence of pollinating that ants do, orchids primarily, through this false mating of male ants. They suspect there's a queen. They'll try to mate, but it's an orchid flower. But ants are really very poor pollinators, and some people hypothesize it's because of all the antibacterial chemical on their body, but really ants of themselves don't disperse very well. The worker ants don't visit numbers and numbers of flowers, and so not the best culture. So this is, again, to go back to when I was a kid, I read so many books about ants. Many of them were like these kids' books that you were shrunk down to the size of an ant. And here's the world of the ants and all this cool stuff. Ants are everywhere. People are fascinated by ants. You got Bug's Life, which, of course, ironically, the lead character, Flick, was voiced by a male performer. If it was a real ant colony, it would have been all girls. But hey, picky, you never want to watch actually a movie with an entomologist that has, an insect theme to it, because we're really not someone you want to sit next to. We go, oh, that's wrong. Classic horror movie, Them, which was great. Loved it as a kid. And of course, Aesop's Fables, the tale of the ants and the grasshopper. So we, as people, have always been fascinated with ants. If you go over to the Dolly Museum in Tampa, you'll see one of his paintings has what basically were probably some of their harvester ants in Spain are in his painting. So ants have been there for a long time. They'll be, we are fascinated. There is a tribe in Central or South America that actually uses these ants as a rite of passage for young males. This is called the bullet ant, Paraponera clavata, or the Hormiga vienta cuatro, the 24-hour ant. because if you're stung by this ant, and you can see in the picture in the upper left, at the very end of its abdomen there, at the very end of its butt, that's a stinger. And this ant is very, very aggressive. This pain, you'll have it for 24 hours. And so what you see on the picture on the right are basically those ant butts sewn into this glove, and the ant butts are sticking up. The idea is you put your hand in that glove and you have to basically endure the pain for a certain amount of time. So pretty serious rite of passage right there. It's a very painful ant, but a beautiful ant. I've seen it in person. It's incredibly large. But yeah, so just an example where ants are also woven, like here, literally into that glove, into culture. And then, you know, there are zombie ants. You may have heard, this seems to make the news every now and then because it's such a great thing to say, zombie ants. So ants, of course, you know, we already said that they have this ability to ward off lots of fungus and bacteria. However, there are species of funguses that will, and it's called cordyceps, I think is the genus. Lots of that kind of fungus out there that attacks all kinds of insects. Basically, gets into the ant's body, spreads inside the ant's body, and like a mushroom, because this is a fungus, once the fungus spreads within the body, eats a lot of the ants, there will be a little mushroom that pops out of the head or behind the neck that grows. This is while the ant's still moving around, by the way. The ant's being consumed while it's alive. And it will change the ant's behavior so that the ant will typically walk up to a blade of grass or something high and then latch onto it with its jaws and then die. And then this stalk fungus will pop out and the spores will spread to other ants below. So it's a really cool thing. So, you know, there is this amazing world of constant, just, you know, eat or be eaten within all of the animal and plant kingdom. But this is it's a really cool thing. And so it's something that if you have time to look up. Pests. Are ants pests? So yeah, fire ants, which originally came from South America, imported on plants into New Orleans, we think, back in the 1940s or 50s. E.O. Wilson did a lot of his studying on fire ants when he was growing up in Alabama. And yeah, it's a big problem. They cause $1 billion per year in damage. Their mounds are often blamed for the death of young cattle. You know, it's a painful sting. You can see that they also do a number on ground nesting birds, sea turtles, because the fire ants will go into the actual sea turtle nests where the eggs are. There's lots of food there. And invasive ants often will outcompete native ants, and that's a huge issue among all the ant folks. What defines an invasive ant? And it's similar to the invasive plant folks, where you see this total spread of an ant with no source of control, you know, basically shoving other ants out of the way of the ecosystem. So we have a lot. They come and go in waves, but fire ants are definitely here to stay. Some invasive ants will tend the true bugs, pest bugs, which may lead to an increase in citrus greening. So there's a lot of, so the invasive ants can definitely knock a lot of the native ants out. They typically will still stay in disturbed areas. So which is why I say here, you know, Native Plant Society, it's in your best interest to keep your yard as native as you can. If your yard has enough sandhill component, bare sand, wiregrass, some longleaf component, you'll harbor native ants. And that's the best thing you can do. Fire ants love grass, just, you know, a lawn, a very typical lawn, medians and roads, disturbances. At the Lake Kissimmee or the Kissimmee Prairie State Park, a lot of the fire breaks have the fire ants that sort of travel along that. So it's a problem. We're not going to get rid of them. By the way, the fire ants are here to stay. The best thing we can do, again, keep your yard native. The native ants will keep the fire ants out. I can definitely tell you that. And all those other things you may have heard about pouring grits on fire ant mounds or hot water. Hot water will actually make them move into your neighbor's yard, so you might want that. But grits, no, that's all. It's not true. And I did forget to mention that ants, their mouth, the adult ants can't eat solid food. They have these jaws, which are basically tools. So it's like if you had a couple of trowels attached to your head, that's what the ant jaws are. But adults can't eat solid food. The larvae have true chewing jaws. And so when ants prey on insects or bring food into the colony, they will feed their larvae bits of the actual insects because they're the ones that can actually crunch up the food. This is a cool thing. So fire ant, this is a University of Florida has been working with a lot of folks to produce and rear these little flies. So in the lower left slide, you can see a fire ant. This is a fire ant worker. And you see that little fly hovering over it. The fire ant looks a little bit freaked out. This is a fly called phorid, P-H-O-R-I-D. That's the genus. They're found worldwide. We have native phorid flies. And in the fire ant's native habitat in South America, these flies, basically what they do is they fly around the workers and they'll lay an egg. They'll inject an egg into the body of the ant. The fly larva hatches in the body, crawls through the body of the ant, eating as it goes, winds up in the head capsule of the ant. And there, the fly basically eats the remainder of the head capsule while the ant is alive. The ant begins to finally slow down. And when that fly is ready to pupate, it'll actually cause the head to pop off. So in that middle picture, you see that head of the fire ant popped off. And inside that, you can see on the lower right, what comes out is an adult fly. So this fly basically grows inside the ant head. It's safe. And it emerges. And you can see how it's emerging. That's the mouth of the ant, by the way, right there. So, you know, when people say they really grossed out by horror movies, I just say, let me tell you about the insect world. It's got so much cool stuff. So this fly has been released. It's been tested that it doesn't prey on native ants. And so fire ants, what this does is not going to eliminate them, but it stresses the colony so much that they don't produce as many queens and males as normal. So it reduces the ability or the potential for the fire ant colonies to spread. So it works really, really well. So that's just and there are videos. You can Google the videos if you want to actually see this in actually action. So now we'll just show you some really cool pictures of ants because the world of microphotography has exploded. And now, and I'll show you at the very end, one website that you can go to and see this stuff. You can see the beauty of these insects up close because you really can't. For a lot of ants, they're not very large. Even the largest ones still aren't large, and the smallest ones are still amazingly beautiful. So we're just going to run through a little gallery of some ants so you can see kind of how I look. So this is an ant called Acanthognathus. And so you're looking right at it, at its head, the eyes on either side, the antenna in the middle, and the jaws go out on either end. What this ant eats, you know, what it does, no one really knows, but it's just an amazing. So I always open up with this picture because it's just so beautiful. Many people think insects are ugly, but if you look real close, they're actually very beautiful. This is an ant called Polyrhacus, which has these really big fish hooks on its body. And these fish hooks are thought to deter predators because if you're a lizard, that's the last thing you really want to swallow is a bunch of hair-covered fish hooks. And these ants can be found in Australia, different places in the Pacific, just absolutely incredibly sculptured. They're covered in these fine golden hairs. Honeypot ant, these are found in the Western United States and in Australia as well. And you may have heard of these because what these ants do in the desert, because the desert is so harsh with its flowering, you know, rains are very infrequent. So when there's rain, there's flowers, there's some sort of nectar sources. These ants will go out and get as much as they can. And there'll be some of the cast members of these ants will hang upside down in the chambers and their bodies are filled with nectar. So they're basically living casks or kegs of food, and they just hang there. So then they can weather the really dry times. And so the other ants will come up to that ant, tap it on its head. Ants will share food from sort of mouth to mouth. They have a main stomach and a second stomach called a crop, and they could actually regurgitate and feed other ants. But what this ant is also known for is the Native Americans would know about these colonies because the colonies the mound is very noticeable in the desert. And so what they would do is they'd eat them. And I've tried these, they're delicious. So you basically pop off the little butt of the ant and you eat them. And they're really good. And so if you're in the desert, you learn to know where these ants are based on what their mound looks like. Another ant called Phodoli, that's the genus, incredibly diverse ant genus worldwide. This is E.O. Wilson's favorite genus. He's discovered so many of these. One of them, actually, the species is called Harrison Fordi, named after the actor Harrison Ford, because he donated some money to help with species protection and diversity studies. So very cool. And this picture is great because it gives you a good look at, these are both the same species of this ant, but many ants, they have basically a larger caste. We typically call them soldiers or majors, and then the smaller one. But it's the exact same ant, exact same genus and species, but the larger one perhaps was fed a little bit differently. Different environmental conditions and hormones allowed that same ant to develop into something larger. So that's a whole other great suite of study, how ants basically develop from larva to pupa to adult by being fed different things, different environmental conditions. But so the larger ones in this genus probably, if you have different kinds and different sizes of workers in a colony, it allows them to basically go for different foods. So like this one, Phodoli, are typically seed eaters, scavengers, lots of insects and stuff. So the larger worker, the larger major, can go after seeds that can crack with those giant jaws and actually allow the colony to have access to a much wider diversity of food. These are really cool, called turtle ants. And we have one species here in Florida, lives in the mangroves, typically in South Florida, on the East Coast too. And same thing, that the picture on the bottom is the same species, but different caste. So the larger one on top, whose head looks basically like a giant dish or a platter, what they do is they plug up the holes in the twigs where they nest. So the picture on the upper left is that ant plugging the hole in the house where the ants live, because many ants live in twigs. So if you want to come in, you got to knock on that, and you can talk with their antenna. That major ant will back up and let the ants come in. So that basically is there as a living door. These are very cool. You may have heard of these from Australia, called bulldog ants or jack jumpers. Incredibly aggressive ants. If you walk near one of their colonies, they will see you. Their eyes are incredibly good. They can see very well. And they have been known to chase people. They actually sort of hop, hop, hop. Another ant with a very painful sting, but a fascinating ant too. So bulldog ants are jack jumpers, and they're quite large. Most ants don't really have great vision. Most ants will use their eyes and the ability to sort of sense polarized light as a way to sort of get around. But remember, most of their lives are underground, so their world is more of a smell. But the ants that have good vision have very good vision. These are army ants. So you've seen, I'm sure you've heard tales of army ants attacking villages. Army ants are very interesting to watch, and sort of how their colonies are so large they can't stay in one place. So they have to constantly move because they eat everything in their area. So that's why they continually move. The one on the right is an army ant from Central and South America. The one on the left is another kind of army ant from Africa. Two different genera. Lots of entomologists will debate on how they're related, how far back. This behavior seems to have evolved over multiple different kinds of ants. And the ones on the bottom, we have army ants in Florida. We have about 4 species. You rarely see them. And they typically will travel underground in the sandhill where the sand is very loose. There's a lot of army ants, and they will raid other ant colonies by basically coming into their colony from underground. And I've been lucky enough to see them a couple times where I've seen ants on the surface just go crazy. They're acting really weird. And I dig down with my trowel, and sure enough, I see army ants in there. This is a cool ant called Mystrium, and it preys on centipedes and millipedes. And the name is very appropriate. There is a lot we don't know about them. But those mandibles, those that look like sort of like ice tongs, grip the centipede and millipede and hold it tight while it's stung. And some millipedes have all these hairs as a defense mechanism. So the little teeth on those jaws actually allow this to strip away the hairs of a millipede and a centipede before this ant stuns it, kills it, and brings it back to its nest. These ants are cool too, called trap jaw or snap jaw ants, so Dinomachus anicetus. And the jaws can go out 180 degrees off of its head, and it's got little hairs in the front. And it's been clocked at one of the fastest speeds known is the trigger mechanism. And if you Google these ants, you'll see video of them snapping. So not only does it snap to catch prey, but it uses it as a way to, it can snap the jaws quick on something solid and flip the ant far away if it feels threatened. I've been stung by pretty much, almost every ant I've studied. This one, surprisingly, has a pretty powerful sting. But we have them in Florida. And one of them that my good friend Mark Dare in Archibald found to be very specific to some of the scrub ridges in Florida. So we do have endemic insects as well as, the more well-known scrub jay. So there is a scrub snapping ant that has been only found on some very, on a few ridges in Florida. So these are all, as a group, called dacetine ants, incredibly small, and you can see the scale bar on that, 0.2 millimeters. These ants basically eat springtails, which are very tiny, tiny insects that live on fungus and all kinds of leaf litter, and their heads are covered in these scales, and they look like feathers or hairs, and no one really quite knows. People have hypotheses on what these are. They could be bait to lure springtails in, and no one really knows. But same kind of thing, their jaws they just walk around with their jaws open, waiting to sort of snap on some prey. But another example of incredibly diverse and beautiful, but also very hard to collect ants. So now we'll look at just some mounds that you'll see in your area, whether it's your yard, whether it's you're walking in the woods. This is a common ant in Florida called the cone ant. And the ants come out of that, they move real fast. This is a great ant to have in your yard because they do a great number. They're workers on killing fire ant queens. When the fire ant colonies produce the winged queens and males, they fly, they mate. The winged queens fall to the ground. They try to find a place to make a new nest. The cone ants do a really great job on getting those new queens, and they will bring them down to their larvae and feed them to their young. So it's a great ant to have in your yard. And that's what they look like up close. And they were called cone ant because of that cone on the body. But also the nest looks like a cone. So I highly recommend, if you see those and I'll go back real quick, you can see it's sandy. They do like some sand, open sand. But that's all you've got to provide. They're everywhere in Florida. Then they'll find your yard. This mound shape, you'll see if you walk in Sandhill, but especially oak scrub, that's been more of that has succeeded from a sort of a wiregrass dominated to maybe more of a oak dominated scrub. This mound is our own leafcutter ant. So the genus is Trachymyrmex, but we have leafcutter ants in Florida. And you'll see this is shaped like a half moon, and the grains are pretty large on that. And you'll find them, if it's a oak hammock with lots of oak trees, you'll find them under every single oak. Because what these ants do, and this is a close-up picture of our own leafcutters, they also grow fungus, but they will grow fungus on caterpillar poop. They'll sometimes go out and collect leaf petals or flower petals, very small ones. But primarily, this ant will grow its fungus on caterpillar poop. And so if you've been in oak hammock and oak scrub, certain times of the year, you'll hear the caterpillar poop raining down from the trees because oak trees are hit with so many different kinds of moth species. So what these ants do is they'll collect that caterpillar poop, which looks like little tiny barrels on the ground, bring it down into their colony, and that's how the fungus will grow. So it is amazing to think of because once you see that half moon, you're going to see them everywhere. And then you're going to realize, holy cow, so these ants are continually bringing this fertilizer into the ground. And of course, our soils in Florida are not the best. So we really don't know how much that these ants contribute to the continual nutrification of our soils, but I suspect it's a lot. So we have a lot of these, and they're tiny, they move real slow. This is the harvester ant's nest, what it looks like on top. The harvester ants are, we only have one species in Florida, and there are dozens and dozens of species out west. And our species is what's called polymorphic, like those Faboli earlier. They have ones with big heads, ones with small heads, so they can take advantage of the seeds and also other kind of food items. They'll have these charcoal rings around the nest, and that's how you'll see it. When we do fires in the habitat, they'll often go out and get charcoal and bring it back. And that's another thing where we really don't know why. There's been all kinds of hypotheses about colonies sort of marking their area, but when you see this surrounding that hole in the ground, you'll know it's a harvester ant. And that's the head of one of the larger forms up close. And hopefully you can see this now. You can have a really great appreciation for this beautiful sculpture and hair. They have probably the most painful sting of any ant in Florida, but they're just very docile. The only time I've been stung by these ants is when I've knelt on them. If I'm collecting ants or I'm studying ants, I put my knees down and I put my knee down on these ants and I feel it, and it lasts for many days. The site where they sting you begins to sweat. It's a very strange sting, but you can pick them, you can hold them in your hand and let them. They're just very, very docile. And of course, this is the fire ant mound. During certain times of the year, when the sun begins to, sort of, as we get toward wintertime and the days get shorter, you'll see these mounds get a little taller. Fire ants are really good at just continually producing queens and males year round. If you sweep your hand through that mound, you'll see large, pupa of the queen and male. They actually get them up high so that they can get, basically the constant warmth. They don't like water too much. I'm sure you've heard tales of the fire ant balls floating on water. But yeah, the best thing, again, I have been asked every single time how to get rid of them. I will say, as much as I don't like using chemicals, Amdro works very well. But you got to be sure to just use it on that fire ant mound. Don't spread it across the yard, because if you do that, it'll kill the native ants, and then what will come back is the fire ants. But it does work. A very, very specific application of Amdro to a fire ant mound will work. But you want to keep your native ants for sure. And that's a picture of a fire ant up close as well. Solenopsis, the species Invicta, which is a great name for it, invincible. But, again, looking up close, that's really kind of beautiful. But you can see that stinger right down there. Oh, and real quick, typical of bees, ants, everything in this group is that only the females sting, because that stinger is a modified egg tube, a modified ovipositor. Male ants, male wasps, male bees can't sting. And as a matter of fact, males in the ant world they're only good for one thing only, and that is to mate. When a colony produces males, when they produce new queens and new males, when they go and fly and they mate, male ant mates, it dies. And in most colonies, the male ants don't do any work. They don't dig anything. They don't go forage for food. They basically are just there for one purpose only. So the ant world truly is driven by females. The males, again, good for one thing only. So the fire ant itself, there's been all kinds of studies trying to figure out ways at the genetic level to maybe reduce its numbers. But again, the best thing we can do, try to keep your yard as native as you can. These ants, twig ants, pseudomyrmex is what they're called, which is interesting because it means false ant. Really big eyes. Anyone on this call, I guarantee you, has been stung by that ant on top. That's the one that is in trees, and if you're in the yard, you'll feel something drop on your neck. You'll feel a little sting. That's it right there. And it came it's all over the tropics. It came in, as best we can tell, on orchids through the Miami airport back in the 40s or 50s, we think. I work a lot with the Florida State Collection of Arthropods, and they have all kinds of records of when we first saw some of these insects. But as a group, these twig ants are really amazing. They live inside hollow twigs. So the picture on the bottom left is an ant carrying a larva inside its twig, split open, very, very big eyes. And they are the ants that are known, you may have heard of the acacia or the bullthorn ants in Central and South America. And that's a picture right there of an ant going into its colony inside that giant acacia thorn. So what do people who study ants do? This is what we do. We go in the woods. We have our collecting tools, and all of them are different. Some people love their trowels, their knives, their short shovels. You know, like anything else in the insect world, we have our favorite tools. And this is E.O. Wilson and his assistant, Stephen Cover, who I was lucky enough to go anting with a few years ago in Alabama and Florida. And, you know, you would think, oh my God, E.O. Wilson, he's probably surrounded by all these different, folks. And it was just him and Stephen and just the nicest guy you could imagine. And he was so excited. He's basically digging at the base of that pine tree, trying to find the ants, the really tiny ants that live in the bark layers. But there's a little pan and a beating sheet, the big square thing. Stefan always carries his giant bag full of stuff. And this is a picture of anters at work. You know, we joke that if you look at people and their different, interests, like the birders are always looking up. And so what are the anters doing? This is what we do. We're looking down. So right there there's some very famous entomologists there. One who passed, actually Roy Snelling with the cowboy hat on. And we're digging a nest. And in that nest, we're trying to find maybe some ants that might be living with that host colony. There's so much we don't know. But so we always say you can tell the anters or the birders, by their binoculars and how they look. Pretty much you can tell who the anters are by their backsides, what they look like when they're on the ground. And this is me. This is my typical pose. I'm a squatter. This is what I do typically. So what I've got in my mouth there is an aspirator. And back in the day when you could bring a lot of things through the airport, that got a lot of strange looks. But basically allows me to suck ants through that tube into a little jar with a screen that protects it from going into my mouth. And then on the far left of your screen, you can see my bag. I use old film vials. In the old days, we had to develop film, and those were perfect. So I would transfer the ants to my vials, take them back, put them on pins, give them labels. It's the people who study insects, the hardest part is the actual curation, the mounting, the labeling. This is really fun, actually exploring. And this is me in the Bahamas, actually, after a recent fire, finding all kinds of cool ants there. And we find new ants all the time. Myself and Mark Dara and our families went to Dominica a long time ago, back in 2006, and found a brand new ant. This is, he named it, it's a Solenopsis, but he named it Enigmatica, or Enigma. He's so good with names. This is a parasitic ant, because we only saw this one ant in this colony of other ants, and it was on, just sort of wandering around. But this ant is shaped in a way that it basically sits on the host queen's back, and it's shaped in a way that it allows it to hang on. Its jaws have these sort of cutouts in it that allows it to grasp the neck of the host ant. And it uses the host colony to rear its own. So it'll lay eggs, and it'll basically use the host colony to raise this ant's eggs, which make more queens and some workers. Some stuff, again, we don't know about it, which is why Mark gave it that cool name. But it was in a common ant colony, which we just decided to open up more of it in this rotten log. And sure enough, in this dark brown ant colony was this golden ant. So it's very cool to find new ants and just to find new stuff. So these are two websites. So this presentation, I guess we're going to record it, but definitely don't take any of the images, because most of them are actually this fellow's image named Alex Wild. And this website here, Myrmikos, definitely go to this website. He is one of the most amazing photographers of insects. And so when you go to the site, you're going to be blown away by how he does that. And then AntWeb is the goal of a friend of mine named Brian Fisher to take a picture of every single ant species, and there's a lot of them. And so it's a great website to go to get this idea of what is out there. Once you make an account there, you can also search for ants in your state, in the world, wherever. So it's a really cool database and also collection of pictures too. And then, so that's it. So I guess, Mandy, that's all I've got.